The Faction of Love, an article by Bennett's Phylactery, posted to Exit Newsletter, June 4th, 2026. The UK authorities have released the footage of the murder of Henry Nowak. The footage is not cinematic. The officer is clearly bored as he cuffs Nowak's corpse-like, already bloodless wrists. He slurs through Nowak's rights, like he's a server at Denny's reciting a scripted upsell. Even when they start to realize something is wrong, I think he's going to be sick. His pupils aren't even reacting. There is no change in tempo. Just another day at the office. Nowak has blood on his clothes. He has blood in his mouth. He has been slashed in the face. He is unable to stand or even sit upright. He is telling the officers, "I have been stabbed." If he were actually that drunk, his assailant's story of fearing for his safety would make no sense. He is obviously not a physical threat to anyone, and there is no reason to handcuff him. The most charitable interpretation of the officers' behavior is that they think they're dealing with a guy who said something racist while blackout, incapacitated, drunk, and therefore deserved to be attacked and arrested. And if anything else happened, they don't want to know about it. This is obviously a massive dereliction of their job as police officers, as articulated to the public. But it's right in line with what they are paid and incentivized to do. If this call requires them to arrest the brown guy, who is surrounded by his friends, it's going to be a very stressful night, followed by a lot of paperwork and media attention for themselves and their bosses the next day, especially if they got anything wrong. On the other hand, if they're a little too rough with the white guy, or it turns out his story checks out better than the brown guy's, they can mumble a whoopsie, and it'll probably be fine. 99 times out of 100. The white guy doesn't have half a dozen internationally funded civil rights NGOs looking for any opportunity to chew their way up the department's ass for the next 18 months. There won't even be a story in the local news about it, let alone internationally. The chain of command will back the officer's play all the way. They probably aren't consciously thinking, "I'm going to let this kid bleed out so I don't get called racist." They're thinking, "I need to be careful how I handle this," and only in one direction. These officers were unlucky. They caught a case in which the facts were so egregious that it blew through all those institutional guardrails, and their one-sided negligence has become a problem. But it's obvious from their affect that this kind of interaction is routine. They know exactly what is expected of them here. This is not a regime animated by pathological, superabundant, suicidal empathy. You are not ruled by people whose greatest weakness is that they care too much. In fact, every single point of failure in this, and many other recent atrocities, is traceable to the obvious reality that nobody gives a shit. Why are there millions of hostile foreign immigrants in Britain? Because, as in the US, mass migration generated enormous power and wealth for a few, while the costs were diffuse and socialized, and there was no organized will to resist. Why are the English forbidden to own kitchen knives? Because the UK government has no theory of the rights of its citizens, and no interest in articulating one. So it stumbles from crisis to crisis, and the easiest way to be seen as responding to a tragedy is to impose deeper and more invasive controls. Why are Sikhs permitted to carry knives? Because the exemption matters more to a small clique of lawyers and NGOs than it does to the general population, and nobody wants to make an issue of it. Why is the accusation of racism from white people. A social superweapon that justifies physical assault, investigation, and arrest. Because the alternative is a complex confrontation with the citizens and their grievances. It is always easier to punish the quieter and less volatile and busier party. Why don't obvious cases of racial violence and abuse from foreigners get investigated and punished? Because the level of tribalism and community complicity in such crimes is so pervasive that to even contemplate punishing, it would require you to examine their collective compatibility with the Western liberal criminal justice system, which would then demand a reevaluation of the entire post-war moral and political order. That sounds like a job for somebody else. Why are the families of the victims always pressured to call for calm and disavow the obvious explanations for what happened before their loved ones' bodies are cold? Is it because the regime functionaries turning the screws on them are so drunk with empathy? Of course not. It's because the alternative would be messy, and the functionaries' desire not to deal with a mess outweighs the family's desire for truth or justice, or even the basic liberty to grieve. It is always easier to tax, accost, threaten, investigate, and jail law-abiding people than it is to arrest criminals. It's always easier to make life steadily worse and less free for people with shit to do than it is to institutionalize the violently mentally ill. It's always easier to bow to the demands of loud unemployed deviants than to advocate for normal people. The people running the homeless industrial complex, and the refugee resettlement NGOs, and the criminal advocacy groups are not animated by overzealous virtue, and they aren't incompetently trying to save the world. They look for ways to make these problems worse, because that's what gets them paid. Of course, at a social level, it would be much easier, low friction, cost-saving, to arrest the handful of chronic offenders in every major city than it is to let them keep terrorizing the public. Reminder that a 25 strikes policy would be a dramatic improvement of our criminal justice system. But at the level of the individual police officer, judge, bureaucrat, the incentive gradient is toward inaction. Canada and the UK are doing worse than the US, not because they are a nation of empaths, but because they have a much stronger culture of keeping your head down and not making waves. These people aren't working idealistically toward some glorious eschaton. This is why liberals don't care when you point out what their pet refugees think about women's rights or homophobia. Feminists, for whom an awkward text is literally rape, don't care that mass migration policies have directly subsidized the sexual slavery of young British girls. Gay activists don't care that some other gays might be thrown off buildings in Gaza. Trans activists don't care who, specifically, needs to stop killing trans people. Race hustlers don't care that the end of Western hegemony would mean a much more forthrightly racist world order. It would not occur to any of these people to argue with you about the end state. They do not have an end state in mind. They aren't thinking that far ahead. None of these costs will fall on them personally. More refugees and homeless people means more budget and more sinecures. Dependent classes reliably vote for jibs, which make them a reliable power source. Busy, productive, thoughtful, independent people, and the things they build, are more conveniently consumed as fuel. That's all that matters to these people. They aren't trying to usher in the workers' paradise. They want power for utterly venal and petty reasons. They like being taken out to lunch and treated like they're important. They like buying nice things. They profit from filth and squalor and discord. And they want more of it, so they can have even more nice things and feel even more important, and they do not care where it's all headed. Our enemies are not slaves to empathy. They are slaves to entropy. Henry Nowak was murdered by the British state when they disarmed him, when they filled his country with enemies, when they beggared him to enrich those enemies, when they overlooked those enemies' escalating violence and cruelty, and arrested anyone who spoke out about it. And finally, when they restrained him and refused to render aid as he bled out. There was no misguided compassion in any of this. Things are just falling apart because nobody's in charge and nobody gives a shit. And there are things about our situation that are unique and unprecedented. But nobody's in charge and nobody gives a shit is actually the default condition. It's the state of nature, the law of the jungle, to be ruled only in the sense that there are organized parasites and predators who are stronger than you. The shape of the entropy, the hierarchy of the predators and parasites, is defined by the logic of mass democracy. The state is not on the side of the dependent and unproductive, because the state is overflowing with compassion, but because the dependent and unproductive have no capacity or property of their own that can be efficiently expropriated, and no means of obtaining power other than mass democratic expropriation from the productive, which makes them exceedingly reliable and energetic clients. So the global state, having broken down and consumed all external power structures, is now starving and consuming all the functional structures within itself, its own vital organs. And we have to understand this, because internalizing this meme, that our enemies are bleeding hearts who care too much, is generating strategic errors. First, you're just lying to yourself. You care. You see what the consequences of all this absurdity will be, all the pointless misery and degradation it will cause, and is already causing, all the beauty that will be destroyed, and you care so much that it overrides the strong impulse to keep your head down. You don't just care because it will affect you. You care because you love your children, your friends and neighbors, and because, perhaps in secret shame, you also care about the fate of humanity. That is literally the difference between you and them. Don't accept the leftists' obviously self-serving conceit, and cast yourself as the villain in their story. Love is the energy that drives heroic action, and to sneer at it is to cut yourself off at the knees. It will also make you the wrong friends. Second, it's just bad messaging. Love covereth the multitude of sins, and accusing your enemies of loving too deeply actually absolves them in the minds of most people. This isn't just a ridiculous lie when it's said of shark-eyed sociopaths like Newsom. It's a lie when your liberal aunt believes it of herself. These people aren't actually too stupid to understand second- and third-order consequences. They don't care about second- and third-order consequences. Those fall on other people, sometime later. But they get to look and feel righteous right now. Some of these people can be shaken awake, but not by leaning into their absurd self-regard. You have to make them care more, not less. Third, you cannot make the world or yourself worse in any way that will disrupt this process of entropy. You do not need to harden your heart. You do not need to sharpen your capacity for cruelty. The obstacle to action on our side is not a lack of sociopaths. The sociopaths are already here, and not to cite the dictionary definition, but they're in it for themselves. The obstacle to action on our side is coordination, trust, and connection. People who lack empathy cannot build it, are not even capable of wanting to build it. The generations that got us into this mess were not deficient in hatred for their enemies. They were deficient in love for their friends and for their own children. They stayed comfortable while the costs fell on other people, while they ran up the bill and left it to their descendants. It would have been relatively clean and easy back then to head these problems off, but they saw no reason to stick their neck out. The love that motivates action had waxed cold. Now we are approaching crises that will require enormous effort and sacrifice and moral courage. The courage to brave morally complex terrain. That work, including the dirty work, will be done by people who love intensely, who have built bonds and friendships that are worth the cost. A man who has a why can endure any how.